Do you know what the sound of an empire collapsing actually is? It is not an explosion. It is the tearing of a hastily signed legal document and the click of a $5,000 Montblanc pen rolling across mahogany. My mother just signed the death warrant of our legacy, thinking she was crowning her golden boy. My brother pops the champagne, oblivious that everything they just stole is a ticking time bomb I set 5 years ago. My name is Eden Calloway, and today I am attending the funeral of the only man I ever loved, surrounded by the people who killed him. Not literally, of course. My father died of a massive cardiac arrest, his heart finally giving out under the weight of cholesterol and 30 years of marital tyranny. But looking around the manicured lawn of our Hamptons estate, watching the Atlantic breeze ripple through the black silk of the funeral tent, I knew the truth. They had eaten him alive, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a bank account number and a hollow chest cavity. The Calloway estate was breathtaking today, a cruel juxtaposition of natural beauty and human ugliness. The ocean crashed against the cliffs below with a rhythmic, indifferent violence. Above, under the sprawling white canopy, 300 of New York's elite mingled, clutching flutes of sparkling water and pretending to mourn. The air smelled of salt and an overpowering stench of white lilies. My mother, Victoria, had ordered $40,000 worth of them. She knew my father was allergic to lilies. It was her final, silent act of dominance, a way of sneezing on his grave before he was even in the ground. I stood near the periphery, my back pressed against the cold stone of the veranda pillar. I wore a sharp, tailored black suit, not a dress. Victoria hated it. She had told me earlier that morning that I looked like a lesbian accountant. I told her I looked like the chief operating officer of Calloway Logistics, which is exactly what I was, or rather, what I was, until the ink dried on the papers inside the leather briefcase of the man just walking up the driveway. But first, I watched the performance. Victoria stood by the mahogany casket, a study in tragic glamour. She wore a black veil that was sheer enough to show her perfectly applied waterproof mascara, but thick enough to suggest modesty. She was holding the hand of Senator Miller, nodding as he whispered condolences. I could see the calculation in her eyes. She was not thinking about her dead husband. She was scanning the crowd, tallying the net worth of the attendees, ensuring that the death of the patriarch did not signal a drop in the Calloway stock price. She was the grieving widow, the matriarch holding the fort, the brave woman left behind. It was an Oscar-worthy performance from a woman whose only true talent was emotional arson. And then there was Julian. My brother stood to her right, looking every inch the grieving son, provided you did not look too closely. He was wearing a custom Tom Ford suit that cost more than my first car. He looked solemn, nodding at appropriate intervals, but his hand kept drifting to his pocket. Checking his phone. He was probably checking the betting odds on the game in London or texting his dealer in Miami. Julian was 32 years old, 2 years older than me, and had never worked an honest day in his life. He had spent 7 years in college and somehow managed to avoid graduating. He was a vacuum of charisma and competence, sucking the life out of every room he entered. Yet today, he was the heir apparent, the golden boy. I took a sip of my water, the ice clinking softly against the glass. A memory surfaced, unbidden. I was 10 years old. I had broken a vase in the hallway, a hideous Ming Dynasty replica Victoria adored. I was terrified. When Victoria came home, Father had stepped in front of me. He told her he did it. He took the screaming, the insults, the cold shoulder that lasted for 3 weeks. He had winked at me afterwards and pressed a chocolate bar into my hand. "We are a team. Eddie," he had whispered. He was a good man. But goodness is a liability in the world Victoria built. He loved me. I knew that. But he feared her more. Over the years, I watched his spine dissolve. He stopped defending me. He stopped defending himself. He retreated into his study and his scotch, leaving me to navigate the minefield alone. I did not blame him, not really. But standing here, watching his wife and son turn his funeral into a networking event, I wished he had fought back just once. Just once. A stir in the crowd drew my attention to the driveway. A black Bentley pulled up, crunching on the gravel. The door opened, and Arthur Sterling stepped out. Sterling was the family lawyer, the legal bulldog of Callaway Logistics. He was a man who looked like he had been born in a three-piece suit. He carried a thick leather briefcase with gold clasps. The chatter under the tent died down slightly. Everyone knew what that briefcase contained. The last will and testament of Robert Callaway. I saw Julian perk up. The boredom vanished from his face, replaced by a hungry, predatory sharpness. He excused himself from a conversation with the vice president of operations and made a beeline for me. He stopped 2 feet away, invading my personal space just enough to be aggressive without drawing attention. He smelled of expensive cologne and stale bourbon. "You look stiff, Eden," Julian said, his voice low and smooth. "Relax. It is a funeral, not a board meeting. Some of us treat the company with respect." "Julian," I replied, keeping my voice even. "Unlike the people who treat it like a personal piggy bank." He chuckled. A wet, unpleasant sound. "Still trying so hard? It is cute, really. You spent 12 years slaving away in those warehouses, fixing supply chains, negotiating with unions. And for what? Dad is gone, Eden. The buffer is gone." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Sterling let it slip to Mom yesterday. The distribution of assets. You might want to start looking for a cardboard box. I hear the ones from the refrigerator shipments are quite spacious." I did not flinch. "Is that so? I assume that is why you are already celebrating?" I saw the crate of Cristal being delivered to the kitchen earlier. A bit tacky for a funeral, don't you think? "It is not for the funeral," Julian smirked. "It is for the rebirth. The king is dead. Long live the king. And the king does not want his buzzkill sister hovering around the boardroom." He patted my shoulder. A gesture that was meant to be comforting to onlookers but felt like a slap. "Do not worry. I will ask Mom to give you a generous severance package. Maybe enough to open that cat shelter you always talked about when you were 6. He walked away before I could respond, strutting back towards Victoria. I watched him go, feeling a cold knot of anger tighten in my stomach. It was not the insult that stung. It was the accuracy of his arrogance. He knew he had won. In their eyes, the game was already over. Suddenly, Victoria's voice cut through the hum of conversation. She was standing near the microphone at the front of the tent. But she was not addressing the crowd yet. She was looking directly at me, and she had raised her voice just enough for the 50 people nearest to us to hear. "Eden!" she called out, wiping a tear from her cheek with a lace handkerchief. "Eden, darling, why are you standing all the way over there in the shadows?" The heads of the board members turned. The shareholders, the investors, the competitors, they all looked at me. Victoria gestured helplessly to the people around her. "She has been so cold through all of this, not a single tear. I keep telling her that family comes first, that we need to lean on each other, but she is just—" She trailed off, letting the silence do the damage. "She is focused on the business. Victoria," one of the older shareholders muttered, trying to be diplomatic. "Business?" Victoria laughed, a brittle, heartbroken sound. "My husband is not even cold yet, and she is probably checking her emails. It breaks my heart. Julian has been my rock, crying with me every night. But Eden, sometimes I wonder if she has any feelings at all." It was a masterstroke. In 3 sentences, she had painted me as the cold, unfeeling corporate machine, and Julian as the empathetic, human successor. If I defended myself, I would look defensive and petty. If I stayed silent, I admitted guilt. I chose silence. I simply nodded my head once in acknowledgement, my face a mask of polite detachment. Let them think I was ice. Ice is harder to break than water. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur Sterling's voice boomed as he stepped up to the podium. "If the immediate family would please join me in the library, Mr. Calloway's instructions were specific regarding the timing of the reading. The air in the tent shifted. The show was over. It was time for the business of death. Victoria took Julian's arm, clutching it for support. They walked past me, leading the procession toward the main house. As she passed, Victoria paused for a fraction of a second. Her eyes met mine. There was no grief in them, only triumph. She looked at me the way a boot looks at an ant. I fell into step behind them, walking alone. The gravel crunched loudly under my heels. The guests watched us go, their whispers rising like the buzzing of flies. "Poor Victoria," I heard a woman say, "to lose a husband and have a daughter like that." "Julian will step up," a man replied. "He has the Calloway charm. Eden was always too intense." I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the grand oak doors of the manor. They loomed ahead, the entrance to the lion's den. I knew exactly what was waiting for me in that library. I knew about the betrayal. I knew about the documents Victoria had coerced Dad into signing while he was medicated. I knew that in 20 minutes, I would be stripped of my title, my home, and my inheritance. I reached into the pocket of my blazer. My fingers brushed against the cool, brushed metal of a USB drive. It was small, no larger than a pack of gum. It contained 12 terabytes of encrypted data, every email Julian had ever sent, every fraudulent invoice Victoria had authorized, every corner they had cut, every bribe they had paid, and the entire architectural blueprint of the proprietary software that actually ran Calloway Logistics. They thought they were walking into a coronation. They did not know they were walking into a trap. I squeezed the drive tight, the edges digging into my palm. The pain was grounding. It reminded me that I was real, that I was here, and that I was not the victim they thought they had created. I walked up the stone steps and crossed the threshold into the house. The hallway was cool and dark, smelling of lemon polish and old money. Julian was already laughing at something Sterling had said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. I allowed myself a smile. It was small, barely visible, but it was there. Let them have their moment. Let them have the champagne and the sympathy and the big, empty house. I had something better. I had the detonator. "After you, Eden," Julian said mockingly, holding the library door open. "Thank you, brother," I said, stepping past him into the room that smelled of leather and impending doom. "You are too kind." The door clicked shut behind us. Sealing the tomb, the reading was about to begin. The silence in the library was heavy, pressing against my eardrums like the atmospheric pressure at the bottom of the ocean. Arthur Sterling's fingers fumbled with the wax seal of the envelope, the sound of the thick paper crinkling echoing off the book-lined walls. That sound, the dry friction of paper, acted like a hypodermic needle, injecting a rush of adrenaline straight into my bloodstream. It dragged me out of the mahogany-paneled room and pulled me back into the grime and noise where my life had actually been lived for the last 12 years. Julian sat across from me, checking his manicure. He looked at his hands as if they were delicate instruments of art. I looked at mine. I had a callus on my middle finger from holding pens for 18 hours a day, and faint scars on my palms from my first year in the distribution center. 12 years ago, I did not start in this corner office. I did not start with a view of the Manhattan skyline or a company credit card. When I joined Calloway Logistics, my father had tried to give me a desk in marketing. Victoria had laughed and suggested I help plan the Christmas party. I refused both. I took a job as a shift supervisor at our Bayonne distribution hub in New Jersey. For 2 years, I lived in a world of gray concrete, fluorescent lights that buzzed like dying insects, and the relentless beep of reversing forklifts. I wore steel-toed boots, not Louboutins. I learned the language of the truckers, the stevedores, and the union reps. I learned that respect in this industry is not bought with a last name. It is earned by knowing the exact weight capacity of a Maersk container and predicting a labor strike 3 days before it happens. I worked the graveyard shift. I processed invoices until my eyes burned. I fixed the inventory tracking system that had been bleeding the company of $80,000 a month simply because no one else had bothered to audit the code. When I finally walked into the corporate headquarters 2 years later, I did not knock. I kicked the door down with a resume that was stained with hydraulic fluid and a profit margin increase of 15% for the Northeast sector. I climbed the ladder rung by bloodied rung, junior analyst, director of operations, vice president of supply chain, and finally, chief operating officer. And where was Julian during my ascent? While I was sleeping on a cot in my office during the blizzard of 2020, ensuring our medical supply contracts were fulfilled, Julian was in Miami. He was supposedly attending business school at the University of Miami. It took him 7 years to complete a 4-year degree. 7 years. During that time, the company credit card assigned to him for educational expenses registered charges that would make a rock star blush. I saw the bills. I was the one who approved them because my father was too ashamed to look. $30,000 for a networking dinner that turned out to be a table at a nightclub. $12,000 for textbooks that were billed from a luxury car rental agency. Julian did not learn macroeconomics. He learned how to chop lines of cocaine on the dashboard of a rented Lamborghini. He returned to New York with a degree that was practically bought and an ego that was entirely unearned. He was given the title of Executive Vice President of Strategy, a role that meant absolutely nothing. His office was down the hall from mine. He came in at 11 in the morning, took 3-hour lunches, and spent the rest of the day flirting with the interns or playing online poker. But the true divergence in our paths, the moment I realized that we were not just siblings but different species entirely, happened 5 years ago. The global shipping crisis. It was a Tuesday. I remember it because I had just poured my first cup of coffee. The news broke that a massive blockage in the Suez Canal, combined with a sudden spike in fuel prices and a dockworker strike in Los Angeles, had essentially frozen global trade. Callaway Logistics had 40% of its capital tied up in cargo that was currently sitting stagnant on the water. We were bleeding cash. The penalties for late delivery were racking up at a rate of $200,000 per hour. The banks were calling. The creditors were circling. My father had a panic attack in the bathroom. Victoria was busy worrying about whether this would affect the timing of her summer gala. I did not panic. I went to war. I moved a cot into the war room. I did not leave the building for 4 days. I lived on espresso and adrenaline. I bypassed the frozen major ports entirely. I called in favors I had spent a decade cultivating. I negotiated a high-risk contract with a private air freight fleet to offload our most critical, high-penalty cargo. I rerouted our ground transport through Canada to bypass the gridlock in the Midwest. I fired 3 incompetent regional managers over the phone. I slept for a total of 6 hours in 4 days. When the dust settled, Callaway Logistics was not just alive. We were the only major logistics firm on the East Coast that had fulfilled 90% of its contracts on time. Our stock price did not dip. It rose. I had saved the empire. The following week, there was a board meeting to celebrate our survival. I walked in, exhausted, wearing the same suit I had worn for 2 days, expecting a nod, a handshake, perhaps a simple, "Well done." Victoria stood at the head of the table. She raised a glass of champagne. "To the Callaway spirit," she had announced, her voice ringing with pride. "And to my son, Julian." His steady hand and vision kept our partners calm during this storm. "He is truly the face of this company." I froze. Julian? Julian had spent that entire week at a golf resort in the Hamptons because the stress of the news was too much for him. I looked at my father. He looked down at his shoes. I looked at the board members. They clapped. They knew the truth, but they also knew who held the voting shares. Victoria continued, her eyes sliding over me as if I were a piece of furniture. "And thank you to Eden, of course, for handling the paperwork. Every great leader needs a good secretary." That was the moment the ice entered my heart. I realized then that no matter how much profit I generated, no matter how many crises I solved, I would never be the king. I was the mechanic. I was the one who kept the engine running so they could drive the car off a cliff. But I stayed. I stayed because I needed to know exactly how deep the rot went. And God, it went deep. 2 years ago, during a routine internal audit I was conducting secretly at 2 a.m, I found the hole. It was a small discrepancy in the marketing budget, a few transfers to a consulting firm in the Cayman Islands. I pulled the thread, and the whole sweater unraveled. Julian. He had been siphoning money, not just petty cash, but millions. He had embezzled nearly $4 million over 3 years. And what did he spend this stolen fortune on? It wasn't even anything tangible. He had poured it into sports betting, losing spectacularly on long-shot parlays. And then, in a stroke of genius stupidity, he had pivoted to digital art investments. I sat in my dark office, the blue light of the monitor illuminating my face, staring at a digital wallet linked to Julian's alias. He had spent $2 million on non-fungible tokens, pictures of pixelated monkeys and bored lions, JPEGs that were now worth less than the electricity used to display them. He had leveraged company assets to buy nothing. I could have gone to the police then. I could have gone to the board. But I knew Victoria. She would have covered it up. She would have sold assets to pay it back and blamed the discrepancy on a clerical error or, more likely, on me. She would have said I wasn't watching the accounts closely enough. So, I became the architect of shadows. I did not report the theft. Instead, I fixed it. I moved funds from the operational surplus of my departments, the ones I ran efficiently, to plug the holes Julian left. I balanced the books. I made the red ink turn black. To the outside world, Callaway Logistics was pristine, but inside my private server, on the very encrypted drive currently sitting in my pocket, I kept the receipts. I kept the original transaction logs. I kept the screenshots of his gambling accounts. I kept the emails where he begged his bookie for more time using his Callaway corporate email address. I tracked every single cent he stole, every lie he told, every document he forged. I cleaned up his mess, but I kept the trash in a bag, waiting for the right day to take it out. The cost of this double life was absolute. I was 30 years old, and I had nothing but the company. I thought of Mark. We were supposed to be married last June. He was a kind man, an architect who loved jazz and cooking. He wanted a home. He wanted a wife who came home before midnight. I remember the night he left. I was supposed to meet him for our anniversary dinner. I was 3 hours late because Julian had drunkenly approved a shipment of hazardous chemicals without the proper permits, and I had to bribe a Port Authority official to prevent the cargo from being seized. When I finally got to the restaurant, Mark was gone. When I got to our apartment, his things were gone. There was a note on the counter. You are married to a corpse. Eden, the company is dead. It just does not know it yet, and I will not lie down in the grave with you. I did not cry. I did not chase him. I drank a glass of water, took a shower, and went back to the office. I had cut away everything soft in my life. Friends, lovers, hobbies, sleep. I had chiseled myself down to a sharp, hard weapon. I was alone. The employees feared me. My family used me. The world saw a cold, heartless executive. They were right. I was cold. But they forgot that cold burns just as badly as heat. The sound of tearing paper snapped me back to the present. In the library, the air was thick with dust and greed. Arthur Sterling had finally managed to rip open the heavy envelope. He slid a sheaf of cream-colored legal paper onto the desk. He adjusted his glasses, clearing his throat with a sound that signaled the end of an era. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes bright with anticipation. Julian stopped checking his nails and sat up straight, a smirk playing on his lips. They looked like vultures realizing the carcass was finally open. I sat back in my leather chair, crossing my legs. My hand rested casually over my pocket, feeling the warmth of the drive through the fabric. Proceed, Arthur, Victoria commanded, her voice trembling slightly with excitement. I watched Sterling smooth out the paper. I knew what it said, but I also knew what came after. They thought this was the reading of a will. They were wrong. This was the reading of an indictment, and I was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. As Arthur Sterling cleared his throat to begin the reading, The sound faded into the background. My mind was not in the library. It was pulled back, violently, to the moment when the last thread of my loyalty had finally snapped. It was not today. It was not the day my father died. It happened 6 months ago, on a night that smelled of burning chemical agents and rain. We call it the Pier 42 incident. The press called it an environmental disaster. I called it the night I realized I was not a daughter, but a disposal unit for my family's sins. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was asleep, the first real sleep I had managed in weeks, when my phone screamed from the nightstand. It was the Port Authority emergency line. A container had ruptured at Pier 42. It was leaking highly volatile industrial solvents. The vapor cloud was spreading toward the residential district of Brooklyn. Hazmat teams were en route. The press was already there. I drove to the docks doing 90 miles per hour. When I arrived, the scene was a nightmare bathed in the strobing red and blue lights of emergency vehicles. The air tasted metallic, coating the back of my throat with a sickly sweet residue. Men in yellow biohazard suits were swarming the container like ants on a piece of rotting fruit. I found the site manager, a man named Henderson. Shaking by the barricade, he shoved a manifest into my chest. "Who authorized this, Eden?" he screamed over the sirens. Who the hell authorized a Class 4 hazardous shipment to dock at a Class 1 pier? We do not have the containment protocols for this. The cooling systems failed immediately. I looked at the manifest. The digital signature at the bottom was unmistakable. It was not mine. It was Julian's. I pulled up the logs on my tablet right there in the rain. At 9 o'clock that evening, Julian had overridden the safety warnings in the system. Why? Because the designated hazardous materials dock at Newark was charging a premium for late-night docking. Julian, in his infinite drunken wisdom, had decided to save the company $4,000 by routing a volatile chemical bomb to a civilian pier in Brooklyn. I tracked his GPS. He was at a private club in Manhattan. I handled the crisis. I spent the next 6 hours coordinating with the fire department, the EPA, and the mayor's office. We contained the leak. No one died, though 12 dock workers were hospitalized with respiratory burns. By the time the sun came up, I was soaked, exhausted, and smelling of chlorine. I went straight to the family estate. I expected to find Julian in a panic. I expected to find my parents horrified. Instead, I walked into the breakfast room to find Julian nursing a hangover with a Bloody Mary, and Victoria calmly buttering a piece of toast. "You have to fix this," I said, slamming the manifest onto the table. "He almost killed people. The EPA is going to fine us $20 million. There will be criminal negligence charges." Julian winced at the noise. "Keep it down. Eden, my head is splitting." Victoria did not even look up from her toast. "We know, darling. Sterling just called. It is a mess." "A mess?" I laughed. A hysterical, jagged sound. "It is a crime. Mother, Julian overrode the safety protocols to save $4,000. He needs to turn himself in. We need to show cooperation if we want to save the company's license." Victoria finally looked at me. Her eyes were hard, like polished stones. "No." "What do you mean?" "No." "Julian cannot take the fall for this," she said, her voice calm and terrifyingly reasonable. "We are in the middle of negotiations for the merger with the Asian Logistics Group. If the heir to the Callaway name is seen as incompetent, the stock will plummet. The deal will collapse." "He is incompetent," I shouted. "He is dangerous." Victoria stood up then. She walked over to me, her silk robe rustling softly. She reached out and smoothed a wet lock of hair from my forehead. Her touch was cold. "He is the face of this family. Eden, he is the future. You are the operator. You are the one who fixes things." I stepped back. "I am not fixing this. I cannot fix a federal crime." "You can," she said softly. "You will take the blame." I stared at her, the air leaving my lungs. "What?" "You will issue a press statement at noon," she instructed, as if ordering dinner. "You will say that it was a clerical error on your part. You were overworked. You made a mistake in the routing codes. You will apologize. You will announce that you are stepping down as COO for a 3-month suspension to reflect on your negligence. You want me to destroy my reputation? For him? I pointed at Julian, who was busy stirring his drink, refusing to meet my eyes. I am asking you to save this family, Victoria snapped, her mask slipping. You are strong, Eden. People expect you to be the workhorse. If you make a mistake, it is a tragedy of overwork. If Julian makes a mistake, it is a character flaw. He cannot survive this. You can... And if I refuse? Victoria smiled. It was the smile of a shark sensing blood in the water. Then I will ensure that the board fires you for cause. I will strip you of your pension, and I will make sure you never work in this industry again. I will burn you down. Eden. I looked at my father. He was sitting in the corner, reading the newspaper. He had not said a word. Dad? I whispered. He lowered the paper. His eyes were watery, filled with shame. He looked at Victoria, then at me. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He went back to reading. That was the moment. That was the exact second the daughter in me died. At 12 o'clock that day, I stood in front of a bank of microphones. The camera lights were blinding. I read the statement Victoria had written. I took the blame. I watched the journalists scribbling furiously, destroying 12 years of my hard work and headlines. Callaway COO admits to negligence. Safety protocols ignored by executive. Julian watched from the sidelines, wearing a look of concerned support. Later that week, the company's stock dipped 3%, then recovered. Julian was hailed as the steady hand guiding the ship while his sister went to rehab for her burnout for the next 3 months. I was exiled. I sat in my apartment, staring at the walls. My phone stopped ringing. The colleagues I had mentored, the clients I had wined and dined, silence. I was radioactive, but silence is dangerous. Silence gives you time to think, time to see things you were too busy to notice before. I realized I was not a partner in this family. I was a bumper on a car. My only purpose was to absorb the impact so the passengers didn't feel the crash. I was an expendable asset. It was during this suspension that I went to see my father in the hospital. The stress of the investigation had triggered his first heart attack. He was weak, hooked up to monitors, his skin the color of parchment. Victoria was out meeting with the lawyers. It was just the two of us. Eden, he wheezed, his hand groping for mine. I am sorry. I sat on the edge of the bed. I did not hold his hand. Sorry for which part, Dad? The part where you let her sacrifice me? Or the part where you watched? I wanted to give it to you, he whispered, tears leaking from the corners of his eyes. The company, the control, I told her. Eden, I told her last year. And? She said she would divorce me. He choked out. She said she would freeze everything. She has the lawyers. Eden, she has leverage on me things from the past. I was a coward. You are still the CEO. Dad, I said, my voice devoid of pity. You could have stopped this. I signed papers, he gasped, his monitor beeping faster. When I got sick, she made me sign power of attorney. Be careful. Eden, she moved the shares. He fell into a coughing fit, and the nurses rushed in to usher me out. That night, I did not go home. I went to a secure internet cafe in Queens, wearing a hoodie and sunglasses. I used a back door into the company server that I had installed years ago, a ghost admin account I used for system maintenance. I dug into the shareholder registry. I looked for the transfer logs, and there it was. On January 21st, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, exactly 10 minutes after my father had been medically induced into a coma following his first collapse, 40% of his personal voting shares had been transferred. Not to Victoria, to Julian. The authorization signature was my father's, but the digital timestamp of the signature key showed it had been executed from a device with an IP address located in the hospital waiting room. My father was unconscious at that time. Victoria had used his digital key. It was fraud. It was theft. It was a felony. I stared at the screen. I should have felt angry. I should have felt betrayed. But I didn't. Instead, a strange, cold calm washed over me. It was like the temperature in the room had dropped 20 degrees, freezing all the pain into a solid, sharp block of ice. I realized that begging for scraps was over. Trying to prove my worth was over. If they wanted to play a game of theft and deception, I would not just play, I would win. But I would not win by fighting them for the scraps of the carcass. I would win by ensuring that when they finally sat down to eat, the meat was already poisoned. I began the plan that night. I called it the takeover. I did not go to the police. The police would take years. The lawyers would settle. A scandal would just hurt the stock price, and Julian would still end up rich. Just slightly less so. I wanted something more absolute. I spent the remaining month of my suspension in the shadows. I set up meetings, not at the Plaza or the Four Seasons, but in diners in New Jersey and coffee shops in the Bronx. I met with the head of the regional licensing board. I didn't bribe him. I simply handed him a file containing the suppressed safety reports from the last 5 years, reports that Victoria had buried. I told him, "Do not act on this yet. Wait until the ownership transfer is finalized. You want the big fish, not the interim manager." He understood. I met with our biggest competitors. I didn't offer them trade secrets. I offered them something more intriguing. I told them, "There is going to be a fire sale soon. Callaway Logistics is going to have a massive liquidity crisis. Keep your cash reserves ready." They thought I was bitter, maybe a little crazy, but they listened. Greed always listens. And most importantly, I activated the clause in my employment contract that I had written myself 7 years ago. A clause regarding intellectual property. I met with a patent lawyer, an old friend from law school who hated big corporations as much as I now did. We spent 3 weeks drafting documents. We created a shell. We created a separation. I was not just building a defense. I was building a guillotine. When my suspension ended, I walked back into the office. I was quiet. I was submissive. I apologized to Julian. I brought Victoria coffee. I signed every paper they put in front of me. I let them believe they had broken me. I watched them relax. I watched Julian grow fatter and lazier. I watched Victoria's eyes gleam with the satisfaction of total control. They thought I was a beaten dog returning to its master. They did not see the wolf in the dog's skin. Now, sitting in this library, listening to the drone of Arthur Sterling's voice, I felt the ghost of that memory, the smell of the chemical leak, the look on my father's face, the timestamp on the share transfer. It was all fuel. Sterling turned the page of the will. Regarding the distribution of the primary assets, I shifted in my chair, the USB drive warm against my hip. Go ahead. I thought, give him everything. Give him the crown. I have already removed the jewels. The final straw had broken the camel's back 6 months ago. Today, I was just here to shoot the camel. The air in the library had become stagnant, thick with the scent of old paper and the heavier, muskier smell of greed. Arthur Sterling adjusted his tortoiseshell glasses, the heavy frames slipping slightly down his nose as he prepared to deliver the final blow. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the legal documents, his voice taking on that monotone drone lawyers use when they are trying to distance themselves from the cruelty they are about to inflict. "To my son, Julian Robert Callaway," Sterling read, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings, "I bequeath the entirety of the real estate portfolio. This includes the primary residence here in the Hamptons, the penthouse apartment on Park Avenue in Manhattan, the ski chalet in Aspen, and the vacation compound in St. Barthélemy." Julian let out a breath, a sound that was half laugh, half sigh. He leaned back in his leather chair, spreading his arms as if to physically embrace the square footage he had just acquired. Victoria reached over and squeezed his knee, a look of vindicated pride plastered across her face. Sterling continued, not pausing for the celebration. "Furthermore, I bequeath the entire collection of vintage automobiles, the private maritime vessels, and the family art collection currently insured for $55 million. The relatives seated in the back, my Aunt Sarah, who had not spoken to my father in a decade but arrived promptly for the funeral, and my cousin Mike, a failed day trader, gasped audibly. They were doing the math in their heads, calculating how much they might be able to borrow from the new patriarch. And, Sterling raised his voice slightly, signaling the main event. Most importantly, regarding the ownership of Callaway Logistics and all its operational assets, shipping fleets, and brand trademarks, I bequeath 100% of the voting shares and controlling interest to Julian Callaway. There it was, the crown, the scepter, the keys to the kingdom. Julian did not just smile. He grinned. It was a wolfish, ugly expression. He looked at me, his eyes dancing with malice. He had won. In his mind, he had not just beaten me. He had erased me. He owned the trucks, the ships, the warehouses, the contracts, and the name. He was Callaway Logistics. And to my daughter, Eden, Sterling said, his tone shifting. It became dismissive, almost apologetic, like a waiter explaining that the kitchen had run out of the prime rib and could only offer a side salad. The room went silent. Even the clock on the mantel seemed to pause its ticking. I bequeath the commercial property located at 42 Industrial Way, Newark, New Jersey. Julian snorted. He couldn't help it. The old overflow shed? He whispered loudly to Victoria. That place is a rat trap. It has been empty since the 90s. Sterling ignored him. And, he continued, the full ownership and assets of the subsidiary entity known as Callaway Tech Solutions, including its current office lease in New Jersey and all associated liabilities, that was it. That was the list. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was not the silence of awe. It was the silence of embarrassment. It was the kind of awkward quiet that falls over a room when someone accidentally spills red wine on a bride's dress. Julian broke it first. He started laughing. It was a genuine, belly-shaking laugh. Tech Solutions? He wheezed, wiping a tear from his eye. You mean the IT department? Dad left you the help desk? What are you going to do, Eden? Reset my passwords for a living? He turned to the room, playing to his audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the new CEO of Fixing the Printer Paper Jam. The cousins giggled. Aunt Sarah hid a smile behind her hand. They looked at me with pity, but it was a delicious kind of pity. They were relieved. If I was the loser, that meant they were not at the bottom of the food chain. I am going to sell that Newark dump immediately, Julian announced, leaning back and crossing his feet at the ankles. I have had my eye on a new Sunseeker yacht. I think I will name it the Inheritance, or maybe the Tech Support. Victoria did not laugh. She composed her face into a mask of maternal concern, the kind that is far more damaging than open mockery. She turned to me, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. Eden, darling, she said softly, please understand. Your father and I discussed this at length. We felt this was best. I looked at her, keeping my face completely blank. Best? You simply do not have the temperament for leadership, she explained, as if speaking to a slow child. You are a worker, Eden. You like to be in the background. The pressure of running the empire would crush you. Julian has the charisma. He has the vision. We wanted to give you something manageable, something small, so you can learn to be independent without hurting yourself. Independent, I repeated flatly. By giving me a shell company that has reported zero profit for 5 years and a condemned building in an industrial park. It is a start, Victoria said firmly. It is a chance for you to prove yourself. If you can make something out of that scrap, then perhaps in a few years, Julian can hire you back as a consultant. Generous? I said. We think so, Julian chimed in. Seriously, Eden, do not feel bad. Someone has to keep the servers running while the adults do business. You are good at typing. Sterling cleared his throat again. looking uncomfortable. I have the transfer documents prepared here, if all parties are in agreement. We can sign the titles immediately. Julian, you will sign for the estate and the parent company. Eden, you will sign for the subsidiary and the Newark property. He slid 2 leather-bound folders across the heavy oak desk. One was thick, overflowing with deeds and stock certificates. That was Julian's. The other was thin, containing barely 10 pages. That was mine. I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. I smoothed the front of my jacket. I walked over to the desk. I am ready to sign, I said quietly. Julian looked surprised. He had expected a fight. He had expected me to scream, to cry, to threaten a lawsuit. He wanted a scene. He wanted to see me break so he could enjoy putting me back together. My compliance robbed him of that satisfaction, but he quickly replaced it with arrogance. Smart girl, Julian said. Know when you are beaten. I picked up the pen. It was the same Montblanc my mother had used. It felt heavy in my hand. I looked down at the document. Transfer of ownership. Callaway Tech Solutions. One moment, I said, pausing with the pen hovering over the signature line. Cold feet? Julian sneered. No, I said, my voice steady and clear. I want an addendum added to the final clause, right here. I tapped the paper with the nib of the pen. Sterling looked up, annoyed. Eden, these documents have been drafted by the finest firm in New York. They are standard. I want it in writing, I said, looking directly at Victoria. I want it stated clearly that as of this signature, the assets are completely severed. Callaway Logistics and Callaway Tech Solutions are entirely separate entities. No cross-liability, no shared debts, no shared assets. If I fail, I do not want Julian coming after me for my debts. And I paused, letting my eyes drift to Julian. I do not want to be responsible for him. Julian laughed again. Responsible for mine? Eden, I just inherited a company worth $600 million. You inherited a debt hole. You are the liability here. I should be the one asking for that clause. Then you should have no problem adding it, I countered. Protect yourself. Julian, cut the dead weight. Make sure I cannot come crawling back to the parent company when I fail. I saw the greed flash in his eyes. I had played him perfectly. He thought I was trying to keep a lifeline. He wanted to cut the rope. He wanted to ensure that when I crashed and burned, I couldn't sue him for support. Do it, Sterling, Julian commanded, waving his hand dismissively. Write it in. Total separation. No takebacks. Whatever she wants. I do not want her begging me for cash in 6 months. Sterling sighed, pulled out a second pen, and handwrote the clause into the margins of both contracts. He initialed it. He spun the papers around for us to sign. Clause 14B. The parties agree that Callaway Logistics and Callaway Tech Solutions are henceforth distinct legal entities with no shared financial or legal liability. Neither party holds claim to the intellectual property, debts, or assets of the other. It was the most beautiful sentence I had ever read. It was a death sentence, but they thought it was mine. I signed. My signature was sharp, angular, and firm. I did not shake. Julian signed his papers with a flourish, underlining his name twice. Done, he declared, slapping the table. The king has arrived. He stood up and popped the cork on another bottle of champagne that had been waiting on the sideboard. He poured a glass for Victoria, then one for himself. He did not offer one to me. Well, Eden, Victoria said, sipping her wine. I suppose you should get going. You have a long drive to New Jersey, and that office probably needs a lot of cleaning. Yes, I said, snapping the cap back onto the pen and placing it gently on the desk. It does. There is a lot of work to be done. I picked up my copy of the contract, the thin, pathetic little folder that contained my useless inheritance. I held it against my chest like a shield. Good luck, little sister, Julian called out as I turned toward the door. Send me a postcard from the poorhouse. I will, I said, stopping at the threshold. I turned back one last time. I memorized the scene. the crystal chandelier, the leather books they never read, the smug satisfaction on their faces. I wanted to burn this image into my mind so that when they were sleeping on prison cots, I could remember exactly how high they had been before the fall. Goodbye, Mother. Goodbye, Julian. I walked out of the library. I walked through the grand foyer, past the portraits of ancestors who would be rolling in their graves if they knew what was coming. I stepped out into the cool afternoon air. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the driveway. I walked to my car, a sensible sedan parked between two Ferraris. I got in, placed the folder on the passenger seat, and locked the doors. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. I looked at the folder. They thought they had given me the scraps. They thought they had given me the empty box. They didn't know that Callaway Tech Solutions wasn't just an IT department. It was the holding company for the proprietary software I had built over the last 5 years. It held the licenses. It held the patents. It held the digital keys to the entire logistics network. And they didn't know that without the keys, their $600 million empire was just a parking lot full of trucks that wouldn't start. I started the engine. I didn't drive toward the highway. I drove toward the gate. I had signed the separation clause. I was free. And because I was free, I was no longer an accomplice. I was a witness. And now, I was a competitor. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the jaws were about to snap shut. The ink on the separation agreement was not even dry before Julian began to flex the muscles of his newfound power. It was as if the signature on that page had flipped a switch in his brain, transforming him from a spoiled child into a tyrant. He did not wait for the funeral guests to leave. He did not wait for the body of our father to be lowered into the ground. He started his reign of terror right there in the hallway of the manor. With the smell of lilies still hanging heavy in the air, I walked out of the library, clutching my folder, intending to head straight to my car. But Julian's voice, loud and booming, stopped me. He was not speaking to me. He was shouting at a woman who was standing by the coat check, holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres that she had likely picked up to help the catering staff. It was Margaret. Margaret had been my father's executive assistant for 30 years. She was 62 years old, a woman with gray hair pinned up in a sensible bun and eyes that had seen every triumph and tragedy of the Callaway family. She was the one who remembered my birthday when my parents forgot. She was the one who snuck me into the office when I was a teenager to show me how the filing system worked. She was the moral compass of the executive suite, the only person who dared to tell my father when he was being unreasonable, and she was the first casualty. Julian strode up to her, his chest puffed out like a peacock. Victoria followed a few steps behind, sipping her champagne, watching with a look of amused detachment. "Margaret," Julian barked. "Put that tray down." Margaret startled, the silver platter rattling in her hands. "Mr. Julian? Is everything all right?" "It is not Mr. Julian," he corrected her, his voice dripping with condescension. "It is Mr. Callaway, CEO Callaway. And no, everything is not all right. I have been reviewing the personnel files in my head. It seems we have a lot of dead weight in the administrative sector." Margaret blinked, confused. "Dead weight? Sir, I have managed the executive schedule and the board minutes for 3 decades. You managed my father," Julian interrupted. Stepping into her personal space, "You enabled his weakness, and more importantly, I have noticed whose office you spend your lunch breaks in. You are always whispering with Eden. You are not loyal to the crown. Margaret, you are loyal to the usurper." "I am loyal to the company," Margaret said, her voice trembling but her chin held high. "And to this family." "Well, the family has changed." Julian sneered. "You are fired. Effective immediately. Hand over your badge and your keys." I stepped forward, my blood boiling. "Julian, you cannot do this. Margaret knows more about the daily operations than you do. She knows where the bodies are buried. Firing her is suicide." Julian spun around to face me, a cruel smile stretching across his face. Ah, the voice from the cheap seat speaks. I can do whatever I want, Eden. That is the beauty of owning 100% of the voting shares. And as for knowing where the bodies are buried, I do not care. I am buying new shovels. He turned back to Margaret, who was now pale, her hands shaking. You heard me. Get out. You have 1 hour to clear your desk at the main office tomorrow, or I will have security throw your collection of cat photos into the dumpster. Victoria stepped up beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. It is the right decision, darling, she cooed. A new leader needs his own team. You cannot have spies from the old regime cluttering up the hallway. It shows strength. Strength. They called bullying an old woman's strength. But Julian was not done. He was on a roll, high on the adrenaline of cruelty. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number of the Human Resources Director, putting it on speaker so we could all hear. Johnson, Julian said when the line connected. This is Calloway. Yes, the new one. Listen, I want to make some changes to the budget for the upcoming quarter. We need to free up some liquidity for the rebranding campaign. Of course, sir, Johnson's tinny voice replied. What did you have in mind? The Legacy Health Plan, Julian said casually. The one for employees with over 15 years of tenure. It is costing us a fortune. Cut it, I gasped. Julian, that plan covers the warehouse foreman. It covers the drivers with chronic back issues. You cannot just cut it. It is part of their contract negotiation. It is a courtesy perk, Julian corrected me, ignoring my outrage. And I'm not feeling courteous, Johnson. Terminate the plan effective midnight tonight. Send out a memo saying we are restructuring for long-term sustainability. And use the savings to increase the budget for the celebration party tonight. I want better champagne. The Cristal we had earlier was a bit warm. Sir, Johnson hesitated. That will affect over 200 families. The union will... Screw the union, Julian snapped. If they do not like it, they can quit. There are plenty of people looking for work. Just do it. He hung up the phone and looked at me, his eyes challenging me to speak. See? That is how you run a business. Eden, you trim the fat to feed the head. You are not trimming fat, I said, my voice low and dangerous. You are cutting the arteries. We will see, he shrugged. Now, speaking of trimming the fat, there is one more loose end. He walked over to me, looking me up and down with disdain. The company apartment in Manhattan, the loft on Fifth Avenue. I have lived there for 6 years, I said. It is part of my compensation package as COO. Former COO, Julian corrected. You are now the owner of a separate entity, Callaway Tech Solutions. Was it? Does Callaway Tech Solutions own that apartment? No, I said, knowing exactly where this was going. Callaway Logistics does. Exactly, Julian smiled. And since Callaway Logistics and Callaway Tech Solutions are now completely separate entities with no cross-liability, as you so cleverly insisted on putting in the contract, you are trespassing. He checked his watch. It is 5 o'clock. I want you out by 5 o'clock tomorrow. Keys on the concierge's desk. If your things are still there at 501, I will have the locks changed and your wardrobe donated to the Salvation Army, although, given your fashion sense, they might reject it. Victoria laughed. It was a light, tinkling sound that grated on my nerves like sandpaper. Oh, Julian, you are terrible. But he is right. Eden, you wanted independence. Independence means paying your own rent. It is time you learned how the real world works. I looked at them, mother and son, the queen and the new king. They were drunk on power, high on the misery they were inflicting. They thought they were stripping me naked, leaving me defenseless in the cold. They did not realize that by cutting my ties, they were untethering the only thing that had been keeping them safe. Fine, I said. I will be out by noon. I turned and walked away. I did not run. I did not cry. I walked with the steady rhythm of a soldier marching to a front line that only she could see. I found Margaret in the staff cloakroom. She was sitting on a wooden bench, clutching her purse, sobbing quietly into a handkerchief. Her shoulders shook with the force of her grief. It wasn't just the job. It was the erasure of her life's work. She had given everything to this family. and they had discarded her like a used napkin. I closed the door softly behind me and sat down next to her. "I am so sorry, Eden," she wept, wiping her eyes. I tried to tell him about the scheduling conflicts for next week, and he just looked at me like I was dirt. "You are not dirt, Margaret," I said softly. "You are the only person in this building with a spine." "What am I going to do?" she whispered. "I am 62. Who hires a 62-year-old secretary? I have a mortgage, my husband's medical bills." I reached into my pocket. I did not pull out a tissue. I pulled out a business card. I had printed it that morning. On my personal printer, on heavy cardstock I had bought myself. It was simple, black text on white background. Eden Tech Logistics, Eden Callaway, CEO. I pressed the card into her hand. "Margaret, look at me." She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. She looked down at the card. "Eden Tech? I thought you got the old IT shed." "I got the future," I said firmly. "I am starting a new company. Margaret, it is going to be small at first. It is going to be hard work. We are going to be working out of that rat trap in Newark for a while. But I need someone to run my office. I need someone who knows the clients, who knows the drivers, and who knows how to make coffee that does not taste like mud. You want to hire me?" "I am not asking you," I said. "I am poaching you. I want you to start tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, and because I know the value of loyalty, I am offering you double your current salary, plus full benefits, starting day 1. Margaret stared at me, her mouth slightly open. "Double? Eden, can you afford that? They said you got nothing." "I have enough," I said, a small, secret smile playing on my lips. "I have been saving, and I have resources they do not know about. Will you join me?" She looked at the card, then at me. The fear in her eyes began to fade, replaced by a spark of hope, and then, slowly, a spark of anger, the same anger that was burning in me. "He called me dead weight," she whispered. "We will show him exactly how heavy we can be," I promised. Margaret wiped her face, sat up straight, and tucked the card into her purse. "I will see you at 8, Ms. Callaway." "Please," I said, standing up. "Call me Eden. We are partners now." I left the estate then. As I drove down the winding driveway, I saw the catering trucks arriving, dozens of them. They were unloading crates of lobster, towers of macarons, and case after case of vintage wine. Julian was throwing a party. That evening, while I was packing my life into cardboard boxes in the Manhattan apartment, my phone buzzed with notifications. Social media was flooding with images from the Callaway estate, the dawn of a new empire. The captions read, there were photos of Julian standing on a table, spraying champagne over a crowd of cheering sycophants. There were photos of Victoria holding court in the garden, wearing a diamond necklace that had belonged to my grandmother. There were photos of the board members, drunk and happy, toasting to the rise of the sun. They were celebrating the future. They were celebrating the trimming of the fat. They were laughing about the insurance cuts and the fired staff. I zoomed in on one photo. It was a picture of Julian and the vice president of operations, a man named Miller. They were laughing, pointing at a tablet screen. On the screen, I could just make out the logistics dashboard of the company. It showed green lights. Everything was running smooth. I set my phone down on a stack of books. "Enjoy it, Julian," I said to the empty room. "Enjoy the lobster. Enjoy the applause." I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 9 o'clock. At midnight, the shift would change. At midnight, the automated system updates that I had scheduled 5 years ago were set to ping the central server for a license renewal verification. And at midnight, the server, which was now legally the property of Callaway Tech Solutions, was going to ask a very simple question. Where is the authorization key? And because Julian had signed the separation agreement, because he had severed the connection to my useless company, the answer would be, access denied. I taped up the last box. I did not feel sad about leaving the apartment. It was just a cage with a view. I was moving to New Jersey. I was moving to a dusty office with peeling paint and bad plumbing. But it was mine, and tomorrow morning, when the sun rose over the Hamptons, the hangover Julian was going to wake up with would have nothing to do with the champagne. I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights one last time. "Checkmate," I whispered. I turned off the lights and closed the door. The party was over. My work was just beginning. I did not drive to New Jersey immediately. There was one final act to the play that required my physical presence. I could have watched the destruction from a safe distance, tracking the collapse on a monitor in a roadside motel. But that would have been like watching a firework display on television. It lacks the heat. It lacks the sound. I wanted to feel the shockwave. I wanted to see the moment the light left their eyes. I stopped at a boutique in East Hampton on my way back to the estate. I used my personal credit card, the one with the limit I had carefully raised over the last 5 years, to buy a dress. I discarded the funeral black. That suit was for mourning a father. The dress I chose was for burying a brother. It was a deep, midnight blue silk that shimmered like oil on water, cut sharp at the shoulders and plunging dangerously low at the back. It was not the attire of a defeated exile. It was the skin of a predator. I arrived back at the Calloway estate at 9 o'clock in the evening. The funeral atmosphere had been completely exorcised, replaced by the thumping bass of a live jazz band and the clinking of crystal. The tent had been transformed with mood lighting, turning the lawn into a glowing, ethereal nightclub. The security guard at the gate, a man named Thomas whom I had hired 3 years ago, hesitated when he saw my car. He looked at his clipboard. My name was likely not on the list anymore. I rolled down the window. "Open the gate." "Thomas, Ms. Calloway," he stammered. "Mr. Julian gave specific orders. He said no family members who are not on the list. I am not family tonight." "Thomas," I said, my voice smooth and cold, "I am a shareholder, and unless you want me to call the labor board about that overtime dispute you had last month, you will open the gate." The gate swung open. I parked my car right in front of the fountain, blocking the path of a Rolls-Royce that was trying to leave. I stepped out, the gravel crunching under my stiletto heels. The air was cool, but I felt a burning heat under my skin. I walked up the steps to the terrace where the main party was in full swing. There were at least 200 people there, investors, local politicians, competitors who had come to sniff out weakness, and sycophants who had come to kiss the ring. When I stepped onto the terrace, the conversation nearest to me died instantly. It rippled outward like a wave. Heads turned, whispers hissed through the crowd. They expected to see a woman broken, red-eyed, perhaps carrying a box of personal belongings, begging for a second chance. Instead, they saw me. I stood tall, a glass of red wine, which I had plucked from the tray of a passing waiter, in my hand. I scanned the crowd until I found them. Julian and Victoria were holding court near the ice sculpture, which was carved in the shape of a massive cargo ship. Julian was flushed, his tie loosened, a cigar clamped between his teeth. He looked like a caricature of a tycoon. Victoria was laughing at something a senator was saying, her hand resting possessively on Julian's arm. I walked toward them. The crowd parted. It was not out of respect. It was out of fear. There was an energy radiating off me that made people instinctively step back. "Eden," Victoria said as I approached. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she plastered it back on. "We did not expect you. I thought you would be halfway to the swamp by now." "I could not miss the toast," I said, raising my glass. "It is a historic night. After all." Julian turned, swaying slightly. He squinted at me, his eyes glassy with champagne and arrogance. "Look who it is," he bellowed, slinging an arm around the senator's shoulders. "My little sister came back to her senses. Did you? Realize that operating a computer repair shop in the ghetto is not as glamorous as it sounds?" The sycophants laughed. Julian grinned, emboldened. "So, what is it?" he asked, stepping closer to me. "Did you come to beg? Do you want your apartment back? I might let you keep it if you agree to work for minimum wage. We need someone to clean the toilets in the executive washroom. You are good at cleaning up messes, right? I did not flinch. I did not blink. I took a slow sip of my wine, tasting the tannins. I am not here to beg. Julian, I said softly. The music seemed to fade as people strained to hear the confrontation, and I am certainly not here to work. I came to watch. Watch what? He sneered. My victory lap? To watch you try to swim, I replied. Now that you have cut off the life jacket, I am the captain of this ship. Eden, he spat, pointing a finger in my face. I do not need a life jacket. I have the power. I have the assets. I have everything. You have the hardware, I corrected him. You have the trucks. You have the cranes. You have the ships. But you forget something basic. Julian, a body without a brain is just meat. He laughed, turning his back on me to address the crowd. She is delusional. Too much stress. Listen to her. She thinks she is the brain. It was exactly 9:15 in the evening. I glanced at my wristwatch. The second hand swept past the 12. In the pocket of my dress, my phone vibrated once. It was a notification. System update complete. License verification. Failed. Protocol. Lockdown. The first sound was not a scream. It was a ringtone. It came from the pocket of the Vice President of Operations, Miller, who was standing 3 feet away from Julian. Miller frowned, pulling out his phone. He looked at the screen, puzzled. He declined the call. 2 seconds later, it rang again. Then, Julian's phone rang. It was sitting on the table next to the ice sculpture. Then Victoria's phone, tucked in her clutch, began to buzz against the glass table. Then the phones of the 3 regional directors who were huddled by the bar. It started as a trickle, a few isolated chirps and buzzes, but within 30 seconds, it was a cacophony. The sound of ringtones, marimbas, classic bells, digital pulses, cut through the jazz music like a discordant siren. Julian looked annoyed. He picked up his phone. What? I am in the middle of a party. I watched his face. I watched the annoyance drain away, replaced by confusion. What do you mean the gate will not open? He snapped into the phone. Use the manual override. Well, find the key. What do you mean the electronic lock is sealed? Miller was shouting into his own phone nearby. The trucks won't start? All of them? That is impossible. Check the ignition. Check the battery. He paused, listening. The dashboard says what? License expired? A murmur of panic started to ripple through the guests. These were people who understood money, and they knew that in logistics, silence is money. But noise, the noise of halted operations, is bankruptcy. Julian hung up the phone and looked at Miller. Get it on the line, now. I am trying, sir, Miller yelled, his forehead suddenly slick with sweat. They are saying the servers are down, all of them. The New York hub, the Los Angeles distribution center, the Rotterdam intake facility, everything is dark. Restart it, Julian screamed, throwing his hands up. Just restart the damn system. We can't, Miller's voice cracked. The system isn't responding. It is asking for an authentication key. It says the operating license for the Callaway Global Logistics Network has been revoked. Victoria stood up, her face pale. Revoked? By whom? We own the company. I took another sip of wine. The liquid was smooth, rich, and deeply satisfying. Actually, I said, my voice cutting through the panic like a scalpel. You don't... Julian spun around to face me. The color had drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and gray. What did you do? I did nothing, I said calmly. I simply accepted my inheritance, remember? Callaway Tech Solutions. That is just a shell company, he shouted, stepping toward me aggressively. It is the company that holds the software licenses, I explained, speaking slowly so he could understand every word. 5 years ago, when I rebuilt the system, I patented the architecture under the subsidiary to protect it from external lawsuits, the operating system that runs your trucks, that unlocks your warehouse gates, that tracks your containers, and that manages your payroll is all intellectual property of Callaway Tech Solutions. I gestured to the phone in his hand, which was ringing again. And since we signed a contract this afternoon stating that our companies are completely separate, with no shared assets, well, Julian, you are currently using pirated software, and my company has a strict policy against piracy, so I turned it off. The silence on the terrace was absolute. The band had stopped playing. The guests were staring, their mouths open. "Turn it back on," Julian hissed. "Turn it back on right now, or I will kill you." "I cannot," I said with a shrug. "We are separate entities. I have no obligation to provide services to a competitor, unless, of course, there is a contract." "Then write a contract," Victoria shrieked. "Do it now." "I am afraid my rates are quite high," I said, checking my nails. "And I'm currently on vacation. I usually do not take new clients on the day of a funeral. It is bad luck." Julian's phone rang again. He answered it on speaker, his hand shaking. "Mr. Callaway." It was the port director of New Jersey. His voice was booming, angry. "Your crane system just shut down with a container suspended over a Maersk freighter. They are threatening to sue us for blocking the berth. Move that container now, or I will have the National Guard drag it into the ocean." I, Julian stammered. He looked at the phone, then at me. He looked like a child who had broken a vase and didn't know where to hide the pieces. "Problem, brother?" I asked. "Fix it," he whispered, all the arrogance gone. "Eden, please, fix it." "I am not the COO anymore, Julian," I said cold-heartedly. "I am just the girl who types, remember?" Miller ran up to Julian. "Sir, the drivers are walking off. The union rep just called. If the payroll system is down, they are not driving. We have $50 million of perishable goods sitting in unrefrigerated trucks. The cooling units are controlled by the central server. The meat will rot in 4 hours." 4 hours? That was faster than I expected. "50 million, Julian breathed. "Victoria, Mom, do something." Victoria turned to me. She tried to summon the matriarchal power she had wielded for 40 years. She stepped forward, her eyes flashing. "Eden Callaway," she commanded. "You are destroying this family. Stop this nonsense immediately. You are being petty." "Petty?" I laughed. It was a low, dark sound. Petty is firing a 62-year-old woman because she was loyal. Petty is cutting health insurance for 200 families to buy champagne. This is business. You taught me that. Mother. In business, there are no friends, only leverage. Well, I have the leverage. I set my wine glass down on the table. The ring of the crystal against the glass was the only sound in the vicinity, aside from the frantic buzzing of phones. "I calculated the losses," I said, addressing the crowd of investors who were now looking at Julian with horror. "Callaway Logistics generates $2 million in revenue every hour, but the penalties for missed deliveries, the spoilage costs, the breach of contract fees, you are looking at $10 million an hour in losses. By sunrise, this company will be insolvent." "You are bluffing," Julian said, though his voice was thin and weak. "Am I?" I pulled a small tablet from my clutch. I tapped the screen and held it up. It showed a map of the world. There were thousands of red dots. Each dot was a truck, a ship, a warehouse, all stationary, all locked. "The code is encrypted with a key that only I possess," I said. "Even if you hire the best hackers in the world, it will take them weeks to crack it. By then, your fresh produce will be compost, and your clients will have signed with FedEx." Julian looked at the screen. He looked at the red dots. He looked at the empire he had just inherited, realizing it was nothing but a heavy sinking stone around his neck. "What do you want?" he asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and desperate. "I want you to understand," I said, leaning in close so only he and Victoria could hear. "I want you to feel what it is like to be powerless. I want you to stand there in your $5,000 suit and realize that you are nothing without me. You are not a king. Julian, you are a parasite, and I just applied the pesticide. I stepped back. The guests parted for me, giving me a wide berth. They looked at me with a mixture of terror and awe. They realized that the quiet woman in the corner had not been hiding. She had been waiting. "Enjoy the party," I said, turning to leave. "I hear the champagne is excellent. You should drink it quickly. I doubt you will be able to afford it tomorrow." I walked away. Behind me, the chaos truly erupted. I heard Julian screaming at Miller. I heard Victoria shouting for Arthur Sterling. I heard the sound of glass breaking. Perhaps a bottle. Perhaps a vase. Perhaps the last remnant of their dignity. I did not look back. I walked down the stone steps, past the fountain, and toward my car. The night air was crisp. I took a deep breath. It tasted sweet. It tasted of freedom. My phone buzzed again. It was a text from Henderson, the port manager who had screamed at me 6 months ago. Message: "System down. Just got a call from Julian screaming. What is going on?" I typed a reply. Response: "Just a technical glitch. I'm starting a new firm tomorrow. Need a reliable partner?" I hit send. As I drove out of the gate, I saw the lights of the estate reflecting in my rearview mirror. From a distance, it looked beautiful, but I knew the truth. Inside, it was burning, and I was the one who had struck the match. The iron gates of the Callaway estate loomed in front of my car, towering and impassable. I pressed the button on my remote to open them, but nothing happened. The heavy wrought iron remained shut, sealing the estate off from the outside world. I pressed it again. Still nothing. A slow, dark smile spread across my face. Of course. The gate mechanism was connected to the central security server, the same server that I had just remotely ordered to shut down. I had locked myself in, but more importantly, I had locked them in. The irony was too delicious to ignore. I could have climbed over the side wall or forced the manual release, but something pulled me back. The chaos erupting behind me on the terrace was a siren song I could not resist. I put the car in park, killed the engine, and stepped back out into the cool night air. I walked back up the driveway. The gravel crunching under my heels sounded like applause. As I ascended the stone steps to the terrace, the scene before me was no longer a party. It was a riot of confused millionaires and panicked staff. The jazz band had stopped playing. The musicians huddled together by the drum kit, looking unsure if they would still be paid. The guests were frantically checking their phones, which were useless without the Wi-Fi that ran through the main house routers that were now bricks. But the center of the storm was Julian. He was standing near the DJ booth, his face a mask of purple rage. He had grabbed the collar of a man in a cheap suit, Lewis, the director of IT. Lewis was a nervous man, sweating profusely, his glasses fogged up with fear. "What do you mean you cannot reboot it?" Julian screamed, shaking the smaller man. "I am the owner of this company. I am ordering you to turn the system back on." "I tried, sir," Lewis stammered, his voice cracking. "I tried the admin override. I tried the physical reset. It is not accepting the commands. The root access is gone." "How can it be gone?" Julian roared, shoving Lewis back against the speaker system. "We own the servers. They are in the basement." "That is just the hardware, sir," Lewis cried, holding his hands up to protect his face. "The operating system, the source code that runs the logic, is rejecting our credentials. It says unauthorized user. It says the license belongs to a third party." "What third party?" Julian bellowed. "We are Callaway Logistics. We are the only party." "It says," Lewis swallowed hard, looking around the room as if searching for an exit. "It says the software license is owned by Callaway Tech Solutions." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of the ocean crashing against the cliffs below. Julian froze. He blinked, the words sinking in like slow poison. He turned his head, his eyes scanning the crowd, searching for me. I did not hide. I walked straight up the steps of the stage, past the confused saxophone player. I reached out and took the microphone from the stand. It gave a high-pitched squeal of feedback that made everyone flinch, drawing every eye in the garden to me. "Testing," I said, my voice amplified, crisp and clear over the speakers. 1, 2, is this thing on? Good. Julian stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. Victoria, standing beside him, looked as if she had been slapped. Arthur Sterling, the lawyer, was wiping his forehead with a handkerchief, looking sickly pale. "You seem confused, brother," I said, my voice echoing across the lawn. "Let me explain it in terms even a playboy can understand." I looked at Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, you are a very expensive lawyer. You charge $800 an hour. Yet, at the will reading today, when my mother gave everything to my brother and left me with the scraps, I just smiled. You must have wondered why. You really should have read the annex on intellectual property a little closer." Sterling stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Eden, what are you talking about? The will was clear. Julian gets the company. You get the subsidiary." "Correct," I said, pacing slowly across the stage, the train of my blue dress trailing behind me like liquid smoke. "But you all made a critical error. You assumed that a logistics company is defined by its physical assets. You looked at the trucks, the ships, the warehouses, and you saw wealth. You looked at the IT department, and you saw a cost center. You saw typing. You saw nerds fixing printers." I stopped and pointed a finger at the massive screen behind the stage, which was currently displaying a blinking red error message. 5 years ago, I continued, during the restructuring after the shipping crisis, I realized something. Our hardware was aging. Our trucks were breaking down. The only thing keeping us competitive was efficiency, speed, the algorithm. I turned to the crowd, addressing the investors. I wrote a new operating system. I called it the neural network. It automates everything. It tells the trucks when to leave to avoid traffic. It tells the cranes which container to pick up first to balance the ship. It manages the cooling systems for the pharmaceutical shipments. It handles the payroll, the tax filings, the customs clearance. I looked back at Julian. And to protect that code from corporate espionage, I transferred all the patents, all the source code, and all the usage licenses to a separate holding company. A company that would lease the software back to the parent corporation. "Callaway Tech Solutions," Julian whispered. The color had left his face completely. "Bingo," I said. "When I signed that contract today, the one where I agreed to take the worthless subsidiary, I walked away with the brain of the company. You, Julian, you kept the body, and as you are discovering right now, a body without a brain is just $600 million worth of dead meat." "You sabotaged us," Victoria shrieked. Stepping toward the stage, her composure was gone. She looked wild, desperate. "You planted a virus." "I did no such thing," I replied calmly. "I simply enforced my property rights. As of 5 o'clock this afternoon, Callaway Logistics no longer has a valid contract to use my software. The separation agreement you made me sign, the one where you insisted on no cross-liability, means I have no obligation to let you use my intellectual property for free. So, I revoke the license." "But we have the trucks," Julian shouted, trying to rally. "We have the drivers. We can run this manually." "Can you?" I asked, tilting my head. "Julian, have you ever been inside one of our new Class A transport trucks? They do not have keys. They are started by a biometric handshake with the central server. Without the server connection, that truck is a 50-ton paperweight. You cannot even put it in neutral to tow it away." I gestured to the phone in his hand. "And the warehouses? The locks are electronic. The cooling systems are automated. Right now, the temperature in the meat locker in the Bronx is rising. In 3 hours, $2 million worth of Wagyu beef will be spoiled. And because the inventory system is down, you do not even know which clients to call to apologize." The investors were muttering loudly now. I heard the words sell, dump, and lawsuit floating through the air. Sterling scrambled up to the stage, sweating. Eden, this is extortion. We will sue you. We will get an emergency injunction. On what grounds, Arthur? I asked, looking down at him. Read the contract you drafted. 2 separate entities. No claim to the other's assets. The software is an asset of Callaway Tech Solutions. You gave it to me. You literally handed me the deed to the engine and kept the chassis. Any judge will laugh you out of court. We will pay you, Julian said, his voice desperate. Fine. You want money? We will pay you a licensing fee. How much? 5%? 10%? I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that silenced the murmurs. Money? I asked. You think this is about money, Julian? I generated $40 million in profit for this family last year alone. I do not need your money. I have the patent. I can license this software to FedEx, to Maersk, to Amazon. They have been trying to buy my code for years. Tomorrow morning, I am going to sell licenses to your biggest competitors. By next week, they will be running twice as fast, and you will still be trying to figure out how to unlock your front gate. Victoria was trembling. She looked at the guests, then at me. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of hatred and terror. You planned this. You sat there at the funeral, pretending to be the dutiful daughter, while you held a knife to our throats. I did not hold a knife, Mother, I said. I held a mirror. You just did not like what you saw. You saw a woman, and you assumed she was weak. You assumed she was stupid. You assumed that because I did not thump my chest and drink scotch like Father, I was not a leader. I walked to the edge of the stage and looked down at her. You told me I was a spare part. You told me I was a component. Well, congratulations. You were right. I am the chip, and without the chip, the machine does not work. Julian lunged. He lost control. He scrambled up the steps, his face twisted in violence. Turn it back on. I will kill you. I will. Before he could reach me, 2 large men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows of the DJ booth. They intercepted Julian effortlessly, grabbing him by the arms and holding him back. Who are they? Julian screamed, struggling against their grip. Security. Help. They are security, I said calmly. My security. I hired them with my own money this morning, because I knew that when a spoiled child has his toy taken away, he usually throws a tantrum. I looked at the crowd. I think the party is over. Everyone, the valets cannot retrieve your cars because the automated key retrieval system is also down. You will have to walk to the main road to call for Ubers. I apologize for the inconvenience, but Callaway Logistics is currently experiencing technical difficulties. Julian stopped struggling. He slumped in the grip of the bodyguards, looking defeated. Eden, please. The company. Dad's legacy. You are destroying it. I am not destroying it, I said, my voice softening just a fraction, but only so the venom could sink in deeper. I am recycling it. I am taking the only part of it that had any value, my work, and I am leaving the rest to rot. You wanted the crown. Julian, you wanted the name? Keep it. Be the king of the rust. I turned to leave the stage. Dropping the microphone, it hit the floor with a loud thud, a final period at the end of a long, painful sentence. Wait, Victoria cried out. Eden, we can negotiate. We can give you shares. We can give you the CEO title. I paused and looked back over my shoulder. I do not want shares in a sinking ship, Mother, and I already have a title. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the business card I had given to Margaret earlier. I flicked it into the air. It fluttered down and landed at Julian's feet. I am the CEO of Eden Tech, and we are currently hiring warehouse managers. Entry level, minimum wage. If you need a job, Julian, send me a resume, but fix the spelling errors first. I walked down the steps. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. They looked at me with fear. Yes, but also with a new, dawning respect. They knew that the balance of power had not just shifted, it had been shattered. I walked past the fountain, past the silent band, and back toward the gate. I pulled out my phone and tapped a single command. Command, override gate lock, open. the massive iron gates creaked and began to swing open slowly. I did not get in my car. I stood there for a moment, listening. I could hear Julian sobbing. I could hear the frantic shouts of the investors calling their brokers to dump Callaway stock before the market opened. It was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. One more thing, I whispered to myself. I tapped another command on my phone. Command: activate protocol, audit trail. Destination: FBI Cybercrimes Division. The trap was not just about stopping the trucks. That was just the leverage. The real blow, the one that would ensure they could never rise again, was already traveling through the fiber optic cables at the speed of light. I got into my car and drove through the open gates, leaving the darkness behind me. The gravel of the driveway crunched violently behind me as I reached for the door handle of my car. I had walked away from the stage, away from the wreckage of the party. But the wreckage was not content to stay burning in the background. It wanted to scream. "You bitch!" The voice was ragged, torn from a throat raw with panic and alcohol. I did not need to turn around to know it was Julian. He had broken free from his stupor on the terrace and was sprinting down the stone steps. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated violence. He was not coming to negotiate. He was coming to hurt me. He was coming to wrap his hands around my throat and squeeze until the reality of his failure stopped staring back at him. I stopped. I turned slowly, my hand dropping from the car door. Julian was 10 feet away, closing the distance fast. His fist was raised, the gold cufflinks catching the light of the estate floodlights. He looked like a madman, his $5,000 suit rumpled, his hair wild. "I will kill you," he screamed, lunging forward. "You ruined everything. I will kill you." He never reached me. Two massive shapes stepped out from the shadows of the hedges, moving with the synchronized precision of a shutting steel trap. It was the security detail I had hired that morning, former military contractors who charged $2,000 a day and were worth every penny. One of them, a man with a neck as thick as a tree trunk, caught Julian's swinging fist in midair. It looked effortless, like an adult stopping a toddler. With a swift, brutal twist, he spun Julian around and pinned his arm behind his back. Julian howled in pain. His face smashed against the hood of my sedan. "Let me go!" Julian shrieked, kicking uselessly at the gravel. "Do you know who I am? I am Julian Callaway. I am the CEO." "We know who you are," the guard said, his voice flat and bored. "That is why we are paid in advance." Victoria came running down the stairs, tripping over the hem of her gown, her heels clicking frantically on the stone. "Let him go! Get your hands off my son! I will have you arrested for assault!" I leaned back against the car door. Crossing my arms over the blue silk of my dress, I looked at them, the mother who had sold me out and the brother who had tried to beat me. They looked small. They looked pathetic. "You will not be arresting anyone, Mother," I said calmly. "In fact, I think the arresting is about to be taken out of your hands entirely." "What are you talking about?" Victoria hissed, pulling at the guard's arm. "Tell your gorillas to release him." I lifted my hand and pointed a single, manicured finger toward the main gate, the gate I had just remotely unlocked. "Listen," I said. At first, there was only the sound of the ocean and Julian's heavy breathing, but then it came, a low wail, rising and falling in the distance, then another, then a dozen. The sound grew louder, sharpening into the piercing yelp of sirens. Blue and red lights began to flash through the trees, strobing against the night sky like a disco for the damned. "What did you do?" Julian whispered, his face pressed against the cold metal of my car hood. "Eden, did you call the police? For a family dispute?" "Police?" I shook my head, a small, pitying smile playing on my lips. "Oh, Julian, you think this is about a family dispute? You think this is about you trying to hit me? You really do have a small imagination." The first SUV burst through the gates. It was not a local patrol car. It was a black, armored Chevrolet Suburban with government plates. Then another, then a third. Behind them, 2 NYPD cruisers followed, but they were just the escort. The vehicles screeched to a halt in a fan formation on the gravel driveway. Blocking any exit, the doors flew open. Men and women in windbreakers poured out. On the back of their jackets, in bright yellow letters, were 3 letters that stop hearts in every corporate boardroom in America. FBI. "Stay where you are," a lead agent shouted, his hand resting on his holster. "Nobody moves." The guests on the terrace above began to scream. I saw people dropping their champagne glasses, scrambling back into the house, trying to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. Julian went limp in the guard's grip. "The FBI? Why is the FBI here?" I walked over to him, leaning down so our faces were inches apart. "Do you remember the Caymans, Julian?" I whispered. "Do you remember the consulting firm you set up? Titanium Holdings? The one you used to funnel $4 million of company money into your crypto wallet?" His eyes widened. "How do you know about titanium?" "I know about it because I was the one who hid it," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly low register. "For 3 years, Julian, I have been using creative accounting to bury your theft. I categorized your embezzlements as research and development costs. I used deferred tax assets to balance the books so the IRS would not trigger an audit. I built a financial dam to hold back the water, just to keep this family out of prison." I stood up and smoothed my dress. "But today, you fired the architect of that dam. You signed a paper that said Eden Callaway is no longer responsible for the financial state of Callaway Logistics. You wanted total separation. You wanted to be the sole owner." I looked at the agent walking toward us. He was holding a warrant. "So, 20 minutes ago, when I left the library, I sent an email. It contained the unredacted ledgers, the real ones. I sent them to the IRS. I sent them to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and I sent them to the FBI Cyber Crimes Division." "You gave them the evidence?" Victoria gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "I complied with the law." "Mother," I said innocently, "as a former officer of the company, I have a duty to report financial irregularities once I am no longer in a position to correct them. I simply forwarded the files. Julian is the CEO. It is his signature on the tax returns. It is his name on the bank accounts." The lead agent reached us. He was a tall man with a face like carved granite. "Julian Robert Callaway?" he asked. "Yes," Julian squeaked. "I am Special Agent Vance with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant for your arrest on 12 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government." The agent gestured to my guard. "Let him up." The guard stepped back. Julian slumped to his knees on the gravel. He looked at the agent, then at me, then at Victoria. "Mom!" he wailed, a sound that was pure childlike terror. "Do something. Call Sterling. Tell them it was Eden. She was the COO. She ran the books." Victoria spun around, her eyes scanning the crowd for the lawyer. "Arthur Sterling, get down here. Do your job." Arthur Sterling emerged from the crowd of stunned onlookers on the terrace. He walked down the steps slowly, looking like a man marching to the gallows. He held his briefcase in front of him like a shield. "Tell them." "Arthur?" Victoria demanded, grabbing his lapel. "Tell them that Eden was in charge of operations. Tell them Julian just took over today. He does not know anything." Sterling looked at Victoria, then at the FBI agents, and finally at me. He looked at the separation agreement that was likely still sitting on the desk in the library. The agreement he had drafted. The agreement he had let them sign. "I cannot help you, Victoria," Sterling said, his voice hollow. "What do you mean you cannot help?" Victoria shrieked. "You are the family lawyer." "I am the company lawyer," Sterling corrected her. "And the document Julian signed 2 hours ago, Clause 14B," he looked at Julian with something akin to pity. "It states that the entities are separate and that the new owner assumes all historical liabilities and obligations of Callaway Logistics. By signing that, Julian retroactively accepted responsibility for the entire financial history of the firm, and since Eden is no longer an employee or a shareholder, and since she voluntarily self-reported the irregularities as a whistleblower, Sterling took a deep breath. Eden has immunity. Julian has the handcuffs. No, Victoria whispered. No, that is not possible. We made her sign it to protect us from her debt. You made her sign it to cut her loose, Sterling said, shaking his head. She used your own greed to construct a perfect legal trap. If you had kept her on the board, she would be liable too. But you kicked her out. You made him the king, and the king is responsible for the kingdom. The agent stepped forward. Julian Calloway, turn around and place your hands behind your back. No! Julian scrambled backward, kicking up gravel. I didn't mean to. It was just a loan. I was going to pay it back when the NFTs went up. Turn around, the agent barked, pulling his taser. Julian froze. Slowly, sobbing, he turned around. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was louder than the sirens. Click, click, click. It was the sound of a legacy ending. I watched as they hauled him up. He looked at me one last time. His eyes were red, wet, and filled with a hatred so pure it burned. You planned this, he spat. You planned this for years. I planned for survival. Julian, I said softly, you were the one who made it a murder-suicide. I just decided not to die with you. The agents began to lead him toward the SUV. The guests were filming it on their phones. The flashbulbs popped, capturing the fall of the Golden Boy in high definition. Tomorrow, these pictures would be on the front page of every newspaper in New York. Victoria collapsed onto the gravel. She did not faint. She just crumpled, as if her skeleton had been removed. She crawled toward the agent. Please, she begged, grabbing the agent's pant leg. He is my son. He is a good boy. He just makes mistakes. Take me. I knew about it. Take me. The agent gently but firmly removed her hand. Ma'am, if you were aware of the fraud and facilitated it, we will be coming for you next. I suggest you call a criminal defense attorney, Mr. Sterling here looks like he might be busy as a witness. Victoria looked up at me. Her face was streaked with mascara. Her expensive gown stained with dust. You are a monster, she whispered. Your own brother. I learned from the best. Mother, I said, you taught me that family is an asset, and when an asset becomes a liability, you liquidate it. I turned back to my car. The bodyguards opened the door for me. I slid into the leather seat. The interior was quiet, insulated from the screaming and the sirens. I looked out the window one last time. They were shoving Julian into the back of the SUV. His head bumped against the doorframe. He looked small. He looked like a child who had finally been told no. Victoria was still on the ground, weeping into her hands, while Sterling stood over her, looking at his phone, probably already calculating how to sever his own ties with the Calloway name. I started the engine. Let's go, I said to myself. I shifted the car into drive and slowly navigated around the blockade of FBI vehicles. An agent waved me through, checking my license plate against a list of non-targets. I was the whistleblower. I was the good guy. As I passed the police cruiser, the red lights washed over my face one last time. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't look back at the party. I drove out through the gates, the iron jaws standing open like a mouth screaming in silence. The road ahead was dark, winding through the Hamptons, leading back to the highway, back to the city, and eventually to a rundown office in New Jersey. I had no inheritance. I had no family home. I had no safety net. But as I merged onto the highway, watching the speedometer climb to 70, I realized I had something Julian never had. I had a clean slate, and I had work to do. I did not keep driving to New Jersey. Not yet. I drove exactly 1 mile down the winding coastal road, pulled into a darkened lay-by, and killed the engine. I sat there in the silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel, watching the rearview mirror. I watched as the strobe lights of the police convoy faded into the distance. hauling my brother to a federal holding cell. I watched as the stream of luxury cars, Bentleys, Ferraris, Porsches, flowed out of the estate gates like rats fleeing a sinking ship. I waited for 40 minutes. I waited until the last rubbernecker had driven away. I waited until the caterers, realizing they would never be paid, had packed up their vans and left in a huff. I waited until the Callaway estate was exactly what it had been before the noise and the lies. A cold, dark pile of stones standing on the edge of a cliff. Then, I turned the car around. I had taken the company. I had taken the legacy. But there was one final item on the inventory list that needed to be addressed. I drove back through the open gates. The driveway was deserted, scarred with skid marks from the FBI SUVs. The front door of the manor was wide open, swinging slightly in the ocean breeze. The lights in the grand foyer were still blazing, casting a long, lonely rectangle of yellow onto the gravel. I stepped out of the car. The silence was heavy, amplified by the sound of the ocean crashing against the rocks below. It was the sound of emptiness. I walked up the steps and crossed the threshold. The house was a wreck. Overturned chairs, shattered champagne flutes, and napkins scattered like confetti. It looked like the aftermath of a riot, which, in a way, it was. I walked through the debris, my heels clicking on the marble floor. "Hello?" I called out. My voice did not echo. It was absorbed by the velvet drapes and the expensive tapestries. I found her in the great room. Victoria Callaway, the Queen of the Hamptons, the woman who had terrorized boardrooms and country clubs for 40 years, was sitting on the floor. She was slumped against the side of the grand piano, surrounded by the ruins of her celebration. Her mascara had run in dark, jagged rivers down her cheeks. Her hair, usually sprayed into an immovable helmet of perfection, was hanging loose and wild around her face. She was holding a half-empty bottle of Cristal, clutching it like a lifeline. She looked up when I entered. Her eyes were red and swollen, struggling to focus. For a moment, she looked relieved, as if she thought I was the police returning to tell her it was all a mistake. Then, recognition set in. "You," she croaked. Her voice was a ruin, stripped of its usual haughty polish. "You came back. Did you come to dance on the grave? Is that it? You want to see me bleed?" I did not answer immediately. I walked over to the fireplace and looked up at the portrait of my father hanging above the mantel. He looked kind in the painting, his eyes soft and yielding. They had eaten him alive. "I came to finish the meeting," I said quietly, turning to face her. "We left some business unresolved." Victoria let out a bitter, jagged laugh. She took a swig from the bottle, spilling wine down the front of her gown. "Business. It is always business with you, isn't it? Just like your father. No heart, just ledgers." "Dad had a heart," I corrected her. "That was his problem. You broke it." She shook her head violently. "I made him strong. I built this family. And you destroyed it in one night. Your own brother, Eden. They took him away in handcuffs. Did you see his face? He was terrified." She pulled herself up to her knees, scrambling toward me across the Persian rug. It was a pathetic sight, the matriarch crawling. She grabbed the hem of my dress, her grip desperate. "Eden, please," she begged, her voice cracking into a sob. "He is your flesh and blood. You have to fix this. You have the codes. You have the system. Call the FBI. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them it was a system error. Tell them you authorized the transfers. You can fake the logs. You are a genius with computers. You can save him." I looked down at her hands clutching my dress. I felt nothing. No pity, no anger, just a profound, icy detachment. "Save him?" I asked. "Why would I do that?" "Because he is your brother," she screamed, shaking my skirt. "Because we are family. We stick together." I reached down and peeled her fingers off my dress. One by one, I stepped back. Putting distance between us, I walked to one of the wing-back chairs, my father's favorite chair, and sat down. I crossed my legs and looked at her. "Family," I repeated. tasting the word. It tasted like ash. That is an interesting word coming from you. Do you remember what you said to me this afternoon? In the library? She blinked, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. What? You said I was a worker, I reminded her. You said I did not have the temperament for leadership, but before that 6 months ago, after the chemical spill, do you remember what you called me then? She stared at me, her mouth slightly open. You called me a component, I said softly. You told me that I was a spare part, an expendable asset to be used to keep the engine running for Julian. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. You were right. Mother, I am a component. I am a machine. And do you know the one thing about machines? They do not have feelings. They do not love. They do not forgive. They just execute their programming, and my programming is logical consequence. I did not mean it, she whimpered. I was just trying to toughen you up. I wanted you to be strong. Liar, I said. The word was not shouted. It was stated like a fact, like stating the time of day. I reached into my clutch. I have one more document for you to see. I did not show this to the FBI. Not yet. I wanted you to see it first. I pulled out a folded piece of paper and tossed it onto the floor in front of her. Victoria looked at it warily. She reached out with a trembling hand and unfolded it. It was a bank transfer record. Recognize that account number? I asked. She squinted at the paper. Then she gasped. Her face, already pale, turned the color of old milk. That is Dad's private retirement trust, I said. The one he set up 30 years ago. The one meant to pay for his medical care. The one meant to ensure he died with dignity. She stammered. I had to. 3 months before he died, I continued, my voice hard as steel. While he was in the first stages of heart failure, you liquidated the entire fund, $2 million. You forged his signature. I watched the realization dawn on her. She knew I knew. You did not spend it on his doctors, I said. You did not spend it on experimental treatments. You transferred it to Julian. To cover his gambling debts so the bookies would not break his legs. You stole the money that was supposed to keep your husband alive, and you gave it to the son who was pissing it away on sports bets. Victoria dropped the paper as if it were burning her skin. He was in trouble. Eden. They were going to hurt him. I had to protect my son. And what about your husband? I asked. Dad died in a state facility. Mother, he died in a shared room because you said the private insurance had lapsed. It hadn't lapsed. You drained it. She went silent. The truth was out, naked and ugly on the floor between us. She had chosen her golden boy over the man who had loved her for 3 decades. She had killed my father by inches to feed Julian's vices. You are evil, she whispered, looking at me with pure venom. You are a cold, heartless bitch. I am what you made me, I replied. But we are drifting off topic. I did not come here to discuss moral philosophy. I came here to discuss real estate. Victoria frowned, confused. Real estate? What are you talking about? Get out of my house. I want you out. Now. She struggled to her feet, trying to regain some semblance of authority. This is my house. I own it. Julian owns it. And since you put Julian in jail, I am the custodian. Get out. Eden. I stayed seated. I looked around the room. The high ceilings, the crystal chandeliers, the ocean view through the French doors. Actually, I said, Julian does not own this house, and neither do you. Of course we do, she snapped. Your father bought it in 1995. He did, I agreed. But last year, when the company was bleeding cash because of Julian's mismanagement, you needed liquidity. You needed cash to hide the losses before the quarterly report. Do you remember? She froze. You took out a second mortgage, I said. A massive one. You leveraged the estate to 80% of its value. You signed the deed over to the bank as collateral for a high-risk commercial loan. So what? She spat. We make the payments. The bank is happy. The bank was happy, I corrected her. Until 5 o'clock today, when I shut down the logistics network. Callaway Logistics technically defaulted on its operational covenants. That triggered an immediate recall of all commercial loans linked to the company's officers. I stood up and walked toward her. She shrank back against the piano. The bank called the loan an hour ago. Mother, they wanted the full $12 million immediately. Obviously, since Julian is in handcuffs and the company accounts are frozen by the FBI, you could not pay. They will give us time, she stammered. We have 30 days to cure the default. Usually, yes, I said, stopping 2 feet in front of her. Unless a third party steps in and buys the distressed debt. Her eyes went wide. She shook her head. No, you didn't. I have been saving my bonuses for 12 years, I said. And I made some very aggressive investments in tech stocks that you laughed at. I had the liquidity. I called the bank manager at 6 o'clock. I bought the note. Mother. I pulled a second document from my clutch. It was a foreclosure notice. I own the debt, I said, and I'm accelerating the payment. Since you cannot pay me $12 million tonight, I am exercising my right to the collateral. I held up the paper. This is my house now. Victoria stared at me. She looked at the walls, the furniture, the life she had built. It was all dissolving like smoke. You cannot do this, she whispered. Where will I go? I don't know, I said honestly, but you cannot stay here. I am your mother, she wailed, falling back to her knees. You cannot throw your mother onto the street. It is the middle of the night. You gave me 24 hours to move out of my apartment, I reminded her. I am being more generous. I am giving you until the sun comes up. The locks will be changed at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Anything left inside after that becomes my property. Eden, please, she grabbed my ankle. I have nowhere to go. My friends saw everything. No one will take me in. I am ruined. You are independent, I said, echoing her words from the library. I am doing this so you can learn to stand on your own 2 feet. Victoria, you always said I needed to be tougher. Well, I am teaching you the same lesson. I pulled my leg free from her grasp. You have 6 hours, I said. I suggest you start packing. Take the clothes, take the jewelry, but leave the furniture, and leave the portrait of Dad. He stays with me. I hate you, she screamed, pounding her fists on the floor. I wish you had never been born. I know, I said. But I was. And that is the problem you should have solved 30 years ago. It is too late now. I turned and walked toward the door, behind me. The sound of her weeping filled the empty cavern of the room. It was a hollow, broken sound, the sound of an empire that had not just fallen, but had been pulverized into dust. I stopped at the doorway and looked back one last time. She looked small. She looked like a stranger. Goodbye, Victoria, I said. I walked out of the house. I walked down the steps. The ocean air hit my face, cleaning the scent of stale perfume and desperation from my skin. I got back into my car. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel happy. I felt light. The weight of 30 years of trying to please them, of trying to be good enough, was gone. I started the engine and drove away. This time, I did not look back. I drove through the gates, leaving the Queen of the Hamptons on the floor of a house she no longer owned, crying for a son who would not be coming home for 20 years. The road to New Jersey was long, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't driving toward a destination someone else had chosen for me. I was driving toward my own. It has been exactly 30 days since the night the lights went out at the Callaway estate. 30 days is not a long time in the grand scheme of the universe, but in the corporate world, it is an eternity. It is enough time for a stock to crash to zero. It is enough time for a board of directors to be dissolved. And it is enough time for a name that once commanded fear to become nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered during business school seminars. I stood in the center of the office on the 42nd floor of the Manhattan skyline. This used to be my father's office for the last 5 years. It had been Julian's office. When I walked in here 3 weeks ago with the deed in my hand, It smelled of stale cigar smoke and expensive cologne. The desk had been covered in scratches from where Julian would throw his paperweights during his tantrums. The shelves had been filled with participation trophies and fake awards he had bought for himself. Now, the room smelled of fresh paint and brewing coffee. The trophies were gone, replaced by servers humming quietly in the corner alcove. The heavy oak desk was still there, but I had sandblasted it down to the raw wood. Removing the varnish, removing the pretension, it looked cleaner. It looked honest. The sign on the glass door no longer read Callaway Logistics. It read Eden Tech and Logistics in simple, sans serif font. No gold leaf, no crests, just the name. The door opened, and Margaret walked in. She was holding a tablet and a steaming mug of black tea. She looked 10 years younger than she had a month ago. The gray pallor of stress was gone, replaced by a healthy flush. She was wearing a new suit, one that she could actually afford now that her salary was commensurate with her worth. "Good morning, Eden," she said, placing the tea on my desk. "The 9 a.m. briefing with the Rotterdam Port Authority is prepped. They are ready to sign the exclusive licensing deal for your tracking software. And the union representative for the drivers is online too. He just wanted to say thank you for reinstating the health plan." "Tell him he does not need to thank me," I said, taking the tea. "Healthy drivers do not crash trucks. It is just good business. What about the hiring metrics?" "We are at 95% capacity," Margaret reported. Tapping her screen, "We have rehired almost every single employee Julian fired. The warehouse team in New Jersey threw a party yesterday when they got their badges back. They sent you a cake. It is in the break room. It says, 'To the boss who knows how to drive.'" I smiled. It was a genuine smile, one that reached my eyes. "Save me a slice, Margaret. I will come down after I finish the paperwork." "Oh, and one more thing," Margaret said, her voice dropping slightly, losing some of its professional crispness. "Arthur Sterling sent over the final asset forfeiture documents regarding the old company. The acquisition is complete. You officially own the entire fleet. We got the trucks for 6 cents on the dollar." "6 cents?" I mused. "That is generous. I would have offered 4. Margaret lingered by the door. "Have you heard from them? Today?" I knew who she meant. "No," I said, turning my chair to look out the window. "And I do not expect to." But that was not entirely true. I knew exactly where they were. I did not need to talk to them to know their fate. I read the legal briefs. I read the news. Julian was currently residing in the Metropolitan Correctional Center. The bail hearing had been a disaster for him. The judge, seeing the mountain of evidence I had provided, the wire transfers, the tax evasion logs, the emails where he explicitly discussed bribing customs officials, had declared him a flight risk. The federal prosecutors were not looking for a settlement. They were looking for an example. They were throwing the book at him. The charges carried a mandatory minimum. He was looking at 15 years. 15 years. He would be 47 when he got out. He would have missed the prime of his life. He would miss the technology shifts, the market changes. When he emerged, he would be a dinosaur in a world that had forgotten his name. And Victoria, I had kept my word. The morning after the party, at 8 o'clock sharp, the locks on the Hamptons estate were changed. The movers I hired, efficient, silent men, packed her personal belongings into boxes. She was escorted off the property by the sheriff. She tried to play the victim. She went to the press. She gave an interview to a tabloid, crying about how her heartless daughter had thrown her onto the street. But the public has a short attention span, and they have no sympathy for billionaires who steal from pension funds. When the story broke about how she had liquidated my father's medical trust to pay for Julian's gambling, the sympathy evaporated overnight. She was now living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Queens. It was a walk-up, 3 flights of stairs. She was surviving on a small state pension and whatever jewelry she hadn't yet pawned. I heard she spent her days writing letters to old friends who never wrote back. She was not in prison, but she was in a cage of her own making, a cage of irrelevance. I turned back to my desk. I had work to do. The phone on my desk buzzed. It was my personal cell phone. I looked at the screen. The caller ID was blocked, but the location tag said Federal Bureau of Prisons, inmate call. The room went silent. Margaret looked at me, her eyes wide. "Do you want me to leave?" she whispered. "No," I said. "Stay." I stared at the phone. It vibrated against the wood of the desk. An angry, persistent buzzing. I could picture him. I could see Julian standing in line at the payphone in the common room, wearing an orange jumpsuit that did not fit, surrounded by men who did not care about his last name. I could imagine his voice. He would be begging, or he would be screaming. He would want money for the commissary. He would want me to hire a better lawyer. He would want to tell me that it wasn't fair, that he was the victim, that I had tricked him. He wanted my attention. That was the only currency he had ever really valued. He wanted to know that he still mattered enough to make me angry. If I answered, even just to yell at him, I would be giving him what he wanted. I would be acknowledging his existence. I reached out a finger. I did not slide the bar to answer. I tapped the small icon in the corner. Block caller. The buzzing stopped instantly. I picked up the phone and navigated to the settings. I permanently blocked the number for the facility. "He will try again," Margaret said softly. "Let him," I replied. "He has 15 years to memorize the dial tone. That is the only conversation he is going to get from me." I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city of New York was spread out below me. A grid of steel and ambition. It was a brutal city. It chewed people up and spat them out. But it respected one thing: competence. I was no longer the daughter of Robert Calloway. I was no longer the sister of the disgraced Julian Calloway. I was just Eden. I looked at the reflection of the office in the glass. It was busy. People were working. The phones were ringing with orders, not complaints. The system I had built, the code I had written during those long, lonely nights, was humming through the fiber optic cables, moving millions of tons of cargo across the globe. I wasn't just fixing the mess. I was building something better. "Margaret," I said, not turning away from the window, "is the legal team ready for the signing?" "Yes," she replied. "They are in the conference room. The representatives from the hospital board are there too." Good. I adjusted my blazer. It was a sharp white suit, no more black. I was done mourning. I walked into the conference room. 12 people stood up as I entered: lawyers, doctors, and administrators. On the table sat a contract. It was not a business deal. It was a deed of gift. "Ms. Calloway," the head of the hospital board said, stepping forward with a smile, "we cannot thank you enough. This donation is unprecedented. The new cardiac wing will save thousands of lives." "There is one condition," I said, taking my seat at the head of the table. "As we discussed." "Of course," the administrator nodded. "The wing will be named the Robert Calloway Memorial Center for Cardiac Health, and the scholarship fund for low-income families will be in his name as well." "And the rest of the terms?" I asked, looking at my lawyer. "Ironclad," the lawyer confirmed. "The endowment is structured so that the name Calloway can never be associated with any donor other than your father. If anyone else, say a family member trying to rehabilitate their image, tries to attach their name to the foundation, the funds revert to a blind trust. The name is protected." I nodded. I was scrubbing the history clean. I was taking the blood money that Julian and Victoria had tried to hoard, and I was washing it in the only thing that could remove the stain: genuine charity. I was ensuring that 50 years from now, when people heard the name Calloway, they would think of healing, not fraud. I picked up the pen. It was a simple ballpoint pen. Cost about $2. I had thrown the Montblanc away. I signed my name. Eden. It was done. The debt was paid. The books were balanced. I walked back to my office, leaving the lawyers to shake hands and congratulate themselves. Margaret was waiting for me. "You did it," she said. "We did it," I corrected her. I walked out onto the balcony. The wind was strong up here, whipping my hair around my face. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of ozone and gasoline and the ocean. It smelled of reality. I looked down at the streets far below. Somewhere down there, people were rushing to work, worrying about their bills, fighting their own battles. I had fought mine, and I had won. Not with a gun, not with a shout, but with a signature. They thought I was weak because I was quiet. They thought I was soft because I was a woman. They thought I was safe because I was family. They were wrong on all counts. I rested my hands on the railing. I felt the vibration of the city under my palms. I was free. I did not owe anyone anything. I did not have to hide anymore. I thought about the last thing Julian had said to me before the handcuffs clicked shut. He had screamed about loyalty. He had screamed about blood. I looked at my hand, at the ink stain on my fingertip from the contract I had just signed. They say blood is thicker than water, but they forget that. In business, ink on a contract is much thicker than blood. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Eden and her cold, calculated revenge. I would love to know where you are listening from right now. Are you tuning in from the busy streets of New York, a quiet room in London, or somewhere else entirely? Please leave a comment below and let me know. I love reading your stories and connecting with you all. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of revenge, justice, and drama, please make sure to subscribe to the channel Blue Payback. Do not forget to hit the like button on this video, and if you really want to support the channel, press that hype button so this story can reach even more people. Your support means the world to me. Until next time, keep your contracts watertight and your secrets safe.